Welcome to Expert Brain. This is going to be an occasional series on my YouTube channel, and here's how it's going to work. One of the best parts about being at a university, about being an academic, is that I have a lot of friends who know a lot of stuff about a couple of things. Some of my friends are ancient historians of the Roman art of cooking with beans. The point is, they have this expertise and it's all in their brain, right? And a lot of times it's hard to draw that out. Even like reading their papers, I don't read their papers, but if you have a conversation with them and if you listen and if you sort of push on different things, you can learn a lot about one of these topics. And so what I'm going to do today, and then what I'm going to do in general with this series is try to have that conversation and try to bring that knowledge to bear on things that we all care about, but that you might not otherwise have been able to sort of access just reading around on the internet or something like that. What I recommend is that you sit down when you've got 45 or 50 minutes to watch this whole video and get out a notebook, right? If you're a huge nerd, I mean, this is what I used to do before grad school. While I was in grad school, I'd open up one of these videos or get a CD that had one of these things and take some notes, right? Throughout the video, I have posted links to other videos, oftentimes on YouTube, oftentimes channels that are not my channel, right? And it's cited in the notes, but then also you'll see if you click on one of these buttons, it's going to take you to a different YouTube channel. You're going to see a different video. So I've tried to provide enough of those throughout so that even if you don't have expertise in the topic, which today is Stoicism, you should be able to sort of get enough of a grasp as we go along. Now, the conversation, I think, is intelligible without those things. You can just listen to it all the way through. But for those of you who really want to find the Easter eggs and sort of hunt down all the rabbit holes, etc., this is the feeling that you would get if you were in grad school, for better or worse, right? Sitting in on a grad seminar, and that's my aim, is to make these sort of the best grad seminars in grad school. So if that's what you're into, buckle up, because it's a long one. It's a 45-minute conversation, but that's going to be the aim, and that'll be the aim with this series in general. I hope you enjoy it. Let me know, I guess, in the comments if you have any particular topics you'd like me to seek out an expert on, and I'll try to do an interview with one of them. But for now, thanks very much for watching it, and enjoy. Hello, Caleb.
Hi.
It's great to see you on this Thursday afternoon. Let me do a bit of an introduction, but then you can kind of fill in the gaps, because honestly, I don't know all of your many qualifications.
Sure.
So you are a professor. You are Professor Caleb Cohoe at Metropolitan State University, and you specialize in, among many other things, ancient philosophy. So you know a lot about Aristotle. You know a lot about the Stoics. You know a lot about Augustine. I forget all the things you know a lot about. Anything else that we should know about you?
No, that's a good start. I mean, I'm into ancient philosophy and then connecting it up with philosophy as a way of life and contemporary discussions in philosophy of religion.
Yeah, cool. And maybe we can even start there. So for anybody that would be watching this that doesn't really know what philosophy as a way of life is, here's a quick way I would characterize it. It's a movement in academic philosophy, honestly. So we both work, in philosophy departments. I'm at Notre Dame. You're at Metropolitan State in Denver. We're in academic departments, but we are part of this movement, and it's kind of a teaching movement. It's kind of a scholarly movement, whatever. It doesn't really matter, but that really focuses on the way in which philosophy interacts with our everyday life, right? So for instance, this big course that I teach here on campus called God and the Good Life, it's really focused not so much on getting people to memorize, okay, who's Aristotle, what are his dates, who's Socrates, what are his dates, when did he die, whatever. But really more okay, what can we take from Aristotle and incorporate in our everyday life? Aristotle thinks you're not going to be happy unless you're virtuous. Okay, what does he mean by that? And what would it mean for me to be virtuous in my life in the everyday world? Does that sound like a fair characterization of philosophy as a way of life to you?
Yeah, well, I think especially in the context we're talking about, it's really about what's your overall goal in life. So you can think of the dispute among these schools as the Epicurean saying, your goal is really a pleasant life. And so we're going to figure out how to achieve that, how to avoid pain. Stoics are saying your goal is a virtuous life. Then you'll really be happy and living in accordance with nature. And then they both have disputes about what your overall goals in life should be, and then promises about how to attain that goal once you accept that goal, and what are the kinds of steps and changes you need to make in your life to get there.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love this. I love thinking about philosophies, at least again, ethical philosophies or practical philosophies, as setting some sort of goal for each of us as individuals, and then trying to tell us, like, here's how to live if this is your goal. Now, one thing that confuses a lot of people that I talk to, my students, and it's just hard for me to keep in mind sometimes, honestly, is, are these philosophies giving us goals that we can just kind of compare and choose between? Or is the idea supposed to be, no, 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 Caleb, because I'm a Stoic, I think that not only do I need to pursue virtue and do I need to practice a certain kind of detachment, whatever, it might be, but you do too, and everybody does. The goal is the same for everybody. Uh, so how do you describe that sort of tension or dynamic? How do you explain that? Like, suppose I'm a freshman in your class. How do you explain that? Like, is the goal supposed to be universal for a particular philosophical tradition?
Yeah, I think in some cases, like there are ancient skeptics who are working off of how it seems, but acknowledge it seems different to different people. So this idea of conflict and it being hard to settle, that's definitely not something we just have today. But I think the way it works out is that most of these schools think that the reasons they put forward, the reasons I put forward, say, for being a Stoic or for being an Aristotelian, are ones that will sound pretty convincing to you once you hear them. And there's some general features we're looking for in an overall goal for life, that if you get to that goal, we should be able to say that your life has gone well and that you're living well. That goal shouldn't require a bunch of other things for you to be in good shape, because then it's not really getting you to, maybe it's a step along the way, but these are sort of the general criteria, and they're criteria that Aristotle lays out in the Nicomachean Ethics, and then a lot of the Hellenistic philosophers pick up on them and explain why pleasure is the thing that on its own will make your life worth living and give you all you need, or virtue is all you need for a good life in the Stoic case.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so the way you're describing it, and I guess it was never struck me before, but I'm going to try this next time I have to describe this to some of my students. It's almost like these philosophies, if we can call them each a philosophy, or maybe we want to call them a philosophical tradition or whatever. But each of these philosophies is almost like a religion, right? In the sense that they've got a view about the kind of thing that you are, the kind of thing that a human person is, what your goal should be, and then how your life should look like if you live in accord with that goal, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in the same way that, like, a Christian would say, look, salvation, like loving Jesus and then being saved, like that's your goal, man. And here's how you do that: go to church every Sunday, etc. It seems like, a lot of these philosophical traditions are similar in that, they're sketching out, like, here's this ultimate goal. And one thing that I noticed as you were describing it is, some of the criteria that people use to identify that goal are interesting, right? That it's kind of sustainable, that it's simple enough, that it's
Mm-hmm.
actually something that you can live in accord with or organize your life around, that, it's kind of self-contained or whatever it is. That's cool. That's
Mm-hmm.
interesting. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, and I think there are real connections. The way I teach in my philosophy of religion class often is this model where you've got some account of what the goal or the flourishing life looks like, that most religions or philosophies in this comprehensive philosophy as a way of life sense have. And then they also have some diagnosis of what's wrong with our current condition. What's the problem that's preventing us from getting there? So the Epicureans think, I'm in pain because of my fear of death and because I worry about success in life and whether people are going to like me and I'm going to have a good job. And that's holding me back from the pleasant life. Or the Stoics think I care about all these things other than virtue, and that's the problem, and that's what's making me anxious and miserable. And so it's both seeing where I want to get to and what the good looks like, and then seeing the obstacles in the way, or the things I may be treating as good or bad in ways that are throwing off my life.
in the same way, just to like, I don't know why, but carry the analogy all the way to the end. In the same way that Christianity says, like, I'm going to diagnose what's wrong with you. You're a sinner. Original sin is just like baked into human nature at this point, and we need a savior, right? Or in the same way that Buddhism, which is an interesting case, right? Because it's actually kind of at the border between like just a pure philosophy or a pure religion. I don't know a ton about Buddhism. Maybe you know a lot more about it, but in the same way that Buddhism is going to say, suffering comes from the illusion that there is being, and to free yourself through ritual, meditation, whatever it might be. Okay, so I'm really loving, I don't know why, but I'm really
Yeah.
loving the religion to philosophy
Yeah.
analogy here.
Yeah, like Buddhism, there's all this desire that you have to get rid of. Epicureans say, no, you don't have to get rid of all your desires, but you have to get rid of all these unnecessary desires to live forever for fame and fortune, and just be content with your lentils. And then you don't have to go the full Buddhist, renounce it all, but you gotta, renounce all that's unnecessary, and then just live content with your friends and a square meal or two a day, and you'll be good to go.
I'm never going to renounce my lentils, Caleb. I get these lentils at Costco. You know the ones. Yeah, I'm never going to renounce those. I'm glad to know that I don't have to on this video. Okay. So you've already like brought up just this plethora, this beautiful bouquet of views, right? Epicureanism, Stoicism, ancient skepticism, and there are varieties of at least the last one. I'm sure varieties of all these things. Okay, let's hone in on one of these, and I want to talk about this particular tradition. And one reason I want to hone in on the one that I have in mind, which I'll just say is Stoicism, and you can kind of make that more complex for us if that's not a maximally helpful category. But one of the reasons I want to hone in on this is Stoicism is having a moment, right? If you look at our culture, I mean, if you're on Instagram, man, and you're scrolling through and the algorithm has sorted you into whatever categories it sorted me into, you're going to come across these quotes all the time, right? From Marcus Aurelius. And they're really powerful quotes. They're things like, remember you will die and all your achievements will turn to dust, and et cetera, whatever. And so it's just everywhere. It's on Instagram. Ryan Holiday, who I know I've mentioned this guy to you. I really appreciate the books that he's written, the work that he's done. He's done a lot to popularize Stoicism. He runs a website called the Daily Stoic that's incredibly popular. But again, he's just permeated the culture. There is a demand for Stoicism. There is an audience for Stoicism. And so I want to ask some critical or hard questions about it. But first, I just want to get everything out on the table. And in the simplest way possible, can you describe, so what is Stoicism? And maybe even, in the terms that you gave us before, what's it diagnosing? What is its goal for our life? How is it promising us that if we get there, our lives are going to be better? Is there a simple thumbnail that you can give us, just a sketch?
Yeah. So here, I'm going to give you two sketches because one I think is the most influential when it comes to the Daily Stoic and Stoic Week and the resurgence, which is this idea of the dichotomy of control that Epictetus really emphasizes. That things are either up to us, they're in our power, or they're not. And your life and will go so much better if you only care about and focus on the things that are up to you. And that means not being attached to anything external. And not just whether your favorite sports team won or lost, but even like what happens to your health, whether you get a promotion, what happens to your family members. That's all outside your control. But you can get really anxious about it when you're attached. Whereas Epictetus's idea is that we just focus on our own choices and our own reactions to things. Then we have something that we can control, and in controlling that, and in choosing to react in a virtuous way, we'll both live well and achieve a kind of peace and harmony. So there's this ancient ideal of ataraxia, freedom from disturbance or anxiety. Yeah, kind of psychological well-being or mental health would almost be a way to translate it into contemporary language. That it's promised you can get that by putting away this focus on externals, trying to get fame and fortune and everything else, and just focusing on getting your mind in order.
Okay, good. Okay, I want to make sure that I'm tracking all of the distinctions, the things that you've just sketched out. So I'm going to describe it back to you, and you tell me if I've totally missed the point or not. And obviously, this is going to be simplified. We are anxious creatures. Diagnosis, or not even diagnosis, but problem. We're worried constantly about our lives. We're worried about, whether we're going to have a job in 6 months. We're worried about whether somebody's going to break into my house and take my stuff. We're worried about, am I going to meet the right person and settle down and have a family? We have all these worries. This might be the most significant fact about us, or the biggest problem that many of us face, just this deep anxiety, not just anxiety psychologically in a moment, although that's, absolutely part of it, but this just deep worry, this deep anxiety. Okay. So it seems like what you're saying is that the Stoics come in and they say, hey, let's distinguish between everything that's in your control and everything that's out of your control. This is the dichotomy of control. Is that what you called it?
Mm-hmm.
The dichotomy of control. What's in your control? What's outside of your control? And in sorting things into those buckets, those categories, and then maybe reflecting on those, calling them to mind, maybe, meditating on this fact that there are some things out of our control, some things in our control, we can reduce that anxiety. We can sort of shape our lives for the better. It reminds me of the Serenity Prayer, which I know through Kurt Vonnegut. He has this in like Slaughterhouse-Five or something, but it's very popular in the culture. And I think it's actually used in Alcoholics Anonymous or something. I don't know. But this prayer where it says like, right, Lord, grant me, what is it? Gosh, I don't know what it is, but like the wisdom to know what's under my control and what's not under my control, and the serenity to like be okay with the things. I just butchered that.
Yeah.
But you get the
Poor
point.
St. Francis.
Am I following? Am I following?
Yeah. Yeah. I think the control is central. And then that gets into part of their diagnosis of how to solve this problem is they think there's a step we take almost all the time without noticing it. That's a really bad step that leads to the anxiety. And that is just automatically assenting to our impressions. So the Stoics distinguish between our initial impressions, which we sort of get from our body and our senses, and then what we do with them, whether we assent to them and make a judgment that those impressions are sort of reflecting reality, reflecting what's really good or bad, or we can have that impression and not assent to it. So I drop my coffee mug and it breaks. It's just my senses and my bodily processing give me that information. But then impressions tend to be value laden, and it's very easy to go right from seeing the mug break to thinking, oh man, my day's ruined. That was my favorite mug. It's going to be hard to get another cool Colorado mug, or whatever, and it's affected my happiness. But no, that's not part of the content of the perception of this object hitting the floor. But it comes along with that sensory impression. And the Stoics think most of us run into these problems because we just let those impressions drag us around without stopping and seeing whether they're impressions we should assent to, or whether we need to withhold assent or reconceptualize them.
Reminds me of this phenomenon that therapists, I love therapy podcasts, and I love therapy. Therapy's amazing. And it reminds me of this concept that gets thrown around in therapeutic contexts, right? Called shoulding. Have you heard of this?
No.
Where you're expressing what is purportedly just a descriptive judgment, right? Like I am out of shape, right? And in revisiting it kind of over and over, what comes out is not only are you out of shape, or you're describing, it's not just a descriptive term. You're saying like, I'm out of shape and I should be healthier, and I should be working out, and I should be, whatever. And the therapeutic insight is that challenging our shoulds. They actually call it's this kind of funny phrase. They say like, you're shoulding all over yourself. Anyway, whatever. But in challenging our shoulds, we can separate out the reasonable ones from the unreasonable ones, right? I should be famous on TikTok by now. I should be a fully tenured professor. I should have done research today. I should have worked out and provided for my family. And then you stop and you say, look, can you do all those things? Like, is that all in your control? And is it true that you should do them? Or is it just that you saw somebody more famous than you on TikTok and you thought like, I should be like that? Yeah, it's similar, right? It's similar in the leap, the jump, the kind of from description, from event to this kind of, I hate to call it this, but the normative kind of layer. I like to yours is value laden.
Yeah.
Sort of layer. And it also makes sense of this thing that here's a puzzle that you just solved for me. I read a Stoic meditation the other day, or actually somebody told me this and I didn't get it. And it was, here it is. I don't even know who this is. What happened? The ship sank. What happened? The ship sank. And you think about it and you think like the first time you say what happened, the ship sank, I'm automatically just like, if it was my ship, I'd be like, shoot, I would say, golly dang, the ship sank, and you think about the way that you would just like impassionately, you watch the ship sink and just be, my life is over. That was all my stuff. Maybe there are people on it, etc. And if you just like stop, reflectively sort of distance yourself from it, ask the question again, and just try to take out those value laden, sort of descriptions, there's a way in which you sort of take back that power that, the value laden stuff, the impressions that are dragging us around. Okay, interesting. I said a lot.
Because that's the way of not making the move from the ship sank to my life is ruined, my business is ruined, I'm never going to be happy, my family's going to starve. That would often make, especially in an ancient context where you don't necessarily have shipping and insurance, and it is a big deal in some ways, but the Stoics don't want you to jump to those conclusions.
So let me ask you something, Caleb. Suppose I am into the daily Stoic. I mean, this is true about me. I love the meditations. I love seeing the quote on Instagram. And a lot of them are just kind of obvious to me, like what I should be taking from it, right? Your achievements will turn to dust. This is just one I made up, but your achievements will turn to dust. This allows me to separate myself from the disappointment that I get when somebody emails me and says, we are once again rejecting your proposal for thus and such. I think like, okay, but my achievements, even the good ones, even the genuine achievements, they'll all turn to dust. I get it. Okay, but my question is, you said at the beginning of this conversation that philosophies tend to have a goal, like a really specific goal and a really specific picture of how your life should be organized, who you are and how this, should inform all your choices, et cetera. Can you tell me more about what that is for the Stoic, maybe in general, or maybe pick a particular Stoic? What is the really, substantive kind of commitment in the background?
Yeah, and that's this is the second part of the sketch, or the original sketch of Stoicism, as laid out by Zeno of Citium, who's the founder, sort of a generation after Aristotle, about 100 years after Socrates, and his goal is just living in accordance with nature. And then he argues that means that requires developing virtue. It turns out that the virtue or excellence is our way to participate through reason in living well, and that all these sort of conventional parts of society, things like being fashionable or well thought of, aren't actually central to the good life. And there's some similarities there with the Epicureans and Cynics. But what's tricky about that, something David Sedley's pointed. Oh,
sorry. Can I ask you a couple questions before we get to the tricky part? What is nature for Zeno, and why is it so great to live in accord with it? Because when you said that, I thought, I don't want to live in the woods, and I don't want to have this constant threat of bear attacks. I assume he doesn't mean nature in the way that I'm kind of thinking of it, just like wilderness or something. What is
Right.
nature, and why is it so
Right.
great to live in accord with it?
Yeah. Well, that was the tricky part I was just
Oh,
getting to.
sorry. All right. Nah.
Yeah, no, we're good.
All
Um,
right.
because yeah, David Sedley's point is
And who is that? Who's the David
David
Settley?
Sedley, a very important scholar of ancient
Okay.
philosophy and Hellenistic schools. Um, Stoicism and Epicureanism are the two big Hellenistic schools, and Epicurus sort of lays everything out and has this very clear goal. He tells you why pleasure is the goal, what he means by pleasure. Whereas Zeno, as you just said, living according to nature, that's a lot more ambiguous. And so you've got a bunch of different Stoics who kind of develop that in different directions. And they all agree you got to live according to nature. But like, yeah, think about art today. Like, what does I have meat eating friends who are like, hunting your own food, like that's the natural and best way to live. I've got vegan friends who are like, that's natural, and eating meat is awful. So I think some of that is there in the ancient context. But what Stoics generally agreed on, and this part maybe doesn't show up as much in the contemporary thing, is that nature is ordered by mind or intellect or nous, which they see as in some way the same as nature and also the same as Zeus, the chief god. So there's this idea that there's this whole big plan and order for the cosmos. And then because there's that good rational order for nature as a whole and the cosmos, and other things are just kind of moved around by that force, by what the Stoics sometimes call pneuma or spirit, that would translate it. But humans have we sort of, Epictetus says Zeus gives us a share of himself, and that's reason, and that allows us to sort of consciously choose to be part of this well-ordered nature and cosmic whole. But the way that we're part of it, and this gets back to goals, is more by fitting in with the whole and agreeing with what's going on than achieving some particular goal. So it's not like I have an individual project, or I have to have a certain number of kids, or write a certain number of books, and then I'll live well. Instead, it's just the quality of the choices themselves that determine whether I'm virtuous or not. So whereas for the Aristotelian, whether you had a good life depends on what you actually accomplished or not. For the Stoics, it is all in how you play the game. And Epictetus explicitly makes this analogy to the ball player, that you see the skill not necessarily when someone's winning and the game is easy, but you can see the skill come out when conditions are quite hard and they have to show their expertise in playing the hand that they're dealt well.
I see. So it's almost to just totally like, piggyback on that analogy. It's almost like, look, there's a difference between losing well and losing in a really ugly way, right? So two people lose a golf game, but one of them just like halfway through gives up and they're breaking clubs and they're like, cursing and whatever. Another person is just trying their best over and over and over. There's a difference. Like the second person is better. They're doing golf better, though they are not necessarily achieving the explicit aim of golf, low score, whatever, etc.
Yeah, someone might be a much more gifted athlete.
Yeah.
They can really bomb those drives, but they get all bent out of shape. And even though their score ends up being a little lower, relative to their natural endowments and what they could be getting, their manifestation of skill might be much lower than the person who shot 10 shots worse off, but really exercised their natural abilities to the utmost.
Yeah, this is cool. So when the Stoics counsel us against putting too much value in achievement and against sort of looking at the world and having this impression, right? Like I could have gotten that promotion, but I didn't. Now my life is ruined and I'm sad, etc. Okay. One thing they're reminding us to do, or one thing that is supposed to help us do, is to live with, say, grace in the moment, rather than to just become totally nihilistic, right? I mean, like, one thing that's sometimes confusing is you come across these Stoic quotes, and it's like, it more or less just says like, all accomplishment is meaningless, the world is valueless, there's nothing out there for you. And you think, well, how is this any different from nihilism, from thinking like, give up, there's nothing good, etc.? Well, what you've given us is an explanation, a good one, I think. Like, yeah, refocus. Given that, like, it's not about the goal, it's about how well you're playing. It's about the form, it's about the style, refocus yourself on those things. Now, one question I have about the big picture, and it relates to this, is just how substantive the background view is. I mean, you skated right over the fact that Stoics think, or some Stoics think, nature is identical to nous, which is supposed to be like what, rationality and reason, etc., which is identical to the gods, or like the mind of the gods or something. I mean, to get the picture that you ended up with, that virtue as defined by, or as defined, in our everyday action, the way that we react to certain situations, in order to get there, we needed this incredibly complex picture that is just full of assumptions, and assumptions that, if I'm just reading the Stoic aphorisms, I could very easily miss, right? Yeah.
If you're reading the Roman Stoics. So here's where we have a difference, that the earlier Greek Stoics that we have only a few fragments from, they were all about the unity of philosophy, where you had to do logic, ethics, and physics, and they're all together, like an egg with a shell, a white, and then the yolk in the middle is actually physics, according to Diogenes, not ethics, as you might think.
Okay.
Though there's a tree analogy where, or a field analogy, where logic's the fence, keeping out the bad stuff, and then physics or natural philosophy, your understanding of the world, gives you the dirt and the trees, and then ethics is the fruit that comes out of that, which I think gets at this idea that it's really got to be deep and rooted.
I mean, this is sounding more and more, honestly, this is sounding more and more like the Western religions that I'm familiar with, because Catholicism, say, which is, I'm Catholic. Catholicism is committed not only to a certain picture of the world and humans' relationship to God in that world, and original sin, and then, like, the salvation plan and all that kind of stuff. But when it comes to a particular human life, the Catholic Church teaches, man, you've got to know ethics, but to know ethics, you've got to do certain, logical exercises. You've got to know critical reason. There is this very unified picture of what kind of a thing we are, and thus what we need to do and know to live well, to live a good life, to flourish, whatever you want to say. And the more you add these layers in here, the more Stoicism sounds like this kind of multi-layered worldview. Maybe is a better term than religion, because Stoicism, it's not a religion, it's a worldview. And so I guess here's the question I want to pose, and this is great because this is the question that I came in with. Can somebody productively engage with what we might call pop stoicism? Can somebody like the Instagram account and thus get these quotes that are floating through your Instagram, etc., without committing to all of these other things? Because I take it most people that visit the Daily Stoic are not of the mind that nature is a unity, which is identical with nous and related to pneumonia, or what do you call it? Pneuma and Zeus, etc., etc., etc. So can you engage? That's my question for you. Can I productively engage with Stoicism, pop Stoicism, without all of the other stuff? Do you think that sort of, pop Stoicism, if you're not committed to all those other stuff and deeply embedded in this tradition, these things, does that entail, like, this isn't really Stoicism, it's kind of a cultural marketing sort of therapeutic, maybe, messaging. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are different kinds of Stoicism, and there's indications like the earlier Stoics might have been more radical and reforming, or at least questioning. Zeno is accused of by some of writing his own republic, which, like Plato's republic, held that you could have women and children in common, and maybe according to Chrysippus, eating dead bodies isn't that bad because it's just part of nature. So there's all this stuff. Like when you think through what living according to what's natural and what's not, you might end up with some surprising answers. Whereas the Roman Stoics are sort of packaging this idea of the centrality of virtue to appeal to a Roman audience, where it's not going to challenge the status quo as much. At least for some of them, like Seneca, who serves under Nero, is eventually forced to commit suicide by Nero. But
just as an aside,
yeah. But first, is willing to maybe try to counsel him. But some people really see him as a sellout, because there was a Stoic resistance that got exiled by Nero, and that Nero really went after, and Seneca maybe didn't do much to stop it. So there's this question of which I think comes up in a lot of religions and philosophies: to what extent are you going to accommodate yourself to the culture, and maybe form some people without them being fully committed Stoics. So to go to your question, I think part of it is pretty easy to use. Specifically, this idea of stopping and examining the impression, because you don't have to buy the whole Stoic story to buy this idea that oftentimes we go straight from having a certain impression to fully going with it, and then examining that can kind of break that linkage, or sometimes cause us to withhold assent from that. And I don't need to agree with the Stoic value analysis in every case. So, personally, I'm not a Stoic, but I find what they say like about mugs really convincing. That I find Epictetus helpful. But like, just a mug for the price of $12 or whatever the new mug is, I can hold on to my happiness instead of thinking, oh no, I'm in trouble. But when Epictetus says the same kind of things about attitudes towards loved ones, that they too are fragile and mortal, don't get attached, get ready to send them back.
Brutal.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that's great advice to tell to you're meditating on this to a loved one. It tends to not be good for your relationship. Right. And that's a point where I just don't agree with the Stoic understanding of what's a value, that I do have attachments to these loved ones outside of myself that really do affect my happiness for better or worse. So that's a point where if you don't fully buy on to that, the only thing we should be caring about is what's internal, then you can't fully commit to some of these Stoic devices that will help what happens to those outside me not affect me as much. And that gets into like this key question where you have to ask, like, not just is it helpful, but is it true? Like, I think some of these techniques, if you use them, could maybe help you separate yourself more from loved ones, but is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, it really depends on what a good life looks like.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, couple of things that I'm taking out of what you just said. One, the Romans were the original Pop Stoics. And I know that's not exactly what you said, but maybe it's fair. But to see how even they were appropriating the practices and the aphorisms, right? And appealing, and in doing so, appealing to a whole different culture without the beliefs, without the background, without the worldview, the context that the Greeks had in initially developing these practices, these aphorisms. I mean, A, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. B, what you're saying here about being able to kind of pick and choose, and that maybe being okay depending on the aphorism, so long as it's not like stop feeling love toward your child because like they're going to die just like your mug, is broken. I mean, there's some element of common sense in there. When I come across something, I think like, eesh. But, one thing that's interesting here is, yeah, in a way, I don't know if you meant to do this, I feel permission to kind of be selective with my engagement with the Stoics in a way that I was worried about before, but in a way that parallels, this might say something terrible about me, but parallels the way I engage with some religious traditions, right? I have headspace and I meditate, and I certainly don't buy into the Buddhist kind of underpinning, and not that they even purport to, have that underpinning. But it's interesting to see the way in which these worldviews or religions or philosophies, can be used, can kind of inform our lives for better or worse.
Yeah, and I think that is an interesting parallel, practices of
Mm.
mindfulness and meditation,
Mm.
where again, you could have very different goals, and I think it looks quite different. Just being aware of your mental states to maybe
Yeah.
deal with anxiety or something, versus being
Yeah.
aware of them in the Buddhist tradition to try to get to a place of emptiness and realization that there is no self. That's
Yeah.
that's that's quite that's going a lot further than like maybe separating out myself but thinking it's still there from the anxieties I'm feeling right now.
Yeah.
But then I think,
Interesting. All right. Oh, go ahead.
yeah, I think it's worth emphasizing that in that sense, I think the comparison to religious traditions is good because there was diversity of thought
Mm.
among the Stoics. So most Stoics accepted this idea that virtue is the only true good, but we can still prefer some things over others. Just
Mm.
like manifesting excellence, like that's the goal in playing basketball or poker or whatever. But I'd
Mm.
prefer to get a good hand rather than a bad hand. I
Sure,
prefer to
sure,
make that
sure.
shot.
Sure.
And so most Stoics thought it was like that with respect to health or having enough
Hmm.
possessions or just being alive. But then there were some radical ones who thought, no, we're going all the way. It's only virtue. I don't
Hmm.
care whether I live or die. Um,
That's terrifying. That is
and then there
terrifying.
was the Stoic who tried to hold on to the preferred indifference, but then got a really painful eye injury and he became a hedonist. He gave up on it. So
I want to
some
hear that full
Diogenes.
story at some point. But I want to end with this because speaking of loved ones, I have a T-ball game to attend. And my parents are in town from Minnesota. And so I think I'm going to have to become indifferent to them unless I actually show up at this thing pretty soon. But I want to end by asking you, are there any Stoic meditations, meditative practices, rituals, aphorisms that you actually incorporate into your everyday life? Or are you just kind of a casual, sort of dipper intoer of Stoicism? Or, do you have any concerted practices like this or no?
Yeah, so I'll mention two smaller ones and then a bigger idea that we haven't gotten to
Mm-hmm.
yet. So the
Yeah.
two small ones, I mean, we already mentioned the mug, and I find that idea in general, just
Yeah.
when it's some kind of material possession or thing I affect, like, or even like getting in, we had to make an insurance claim recently.
Sure.
And you can think, no,
Sorry.
my rates, or you can just think, oh,
Yeah.
it's X amount of dollars. We
Yeah.
can live with that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and then this idea, which I like, Epictetus talks about going to the baths. I think about taking my kids to the pool in the summer,
Okay.
where if you think ahead and think of all the things that could go wrong, all
Mm.
the traffic you might encounter, how hot it might be,
Yeah.
then it's just easier to handle than if you assume everything's going to go smoothly. And I
Mm.
only budget, just enough time so that we can get there if there's no traffic, and don't have, redundant sunscreen because we might forget it. just just
Sure.
just
Sure.
thinking through, sort of assuming the worst, facing that, and then
Mm.
in a way it's all good after that. um
Mm.
but then there's a bigger, I think one thing that's sometimes missed in pop stoicism is this idea of being a citizen of the cosmos that's really central
Mm.
to the overall Stoic view. Um, and then Augustine actually picks up in Christian philosophy that's a
Mm.
project I'm working on, that we go from just caring about ourselves to this process that the Stoics called oikeiosis, which is making more and more of the cosmos oikeon, our own, or part of our own household. Oikos is just the word for household, and
Hmm.
coming to see expanding our circle of care outwards so that I don't just care about myself. I don't just care about myself and my family, but I see myself as part of this whole community. And that's a struggle, and it's hard to get, just to get outside of ourselves, much
Yeah.
less outside of our family and including everyone else. But
Yeah.
that's something I'm really focused on. But then in a context where, I think it makes a difference whether you just think there's this cosmos out there that we're sort of part of, but we might end up just being a foot that has to be trampled through the mud, as Epictetus said, versus like this understanding of providence in Christianity or the Abrahamic religions, where each person has their own individual good as well as a shared common good. So I think that's another interesting case where you can either have you're going to miss out on some of the Stoic ideas if you don't think there's any providence, and you can sort of focus on what's on our control, but I can also get really mad at the hand of cards I've been dealt. Or you can be like Epictetus and be like, well, maybe I'm a foot, maybe I'm a gallbladder, maybe I'm an eye, who knows, I'm just going to go with it. Versus this idea of a combination of an individual good life for everyone and a common good that's shared by all in the Abrahamic traditions. So
Yeah, interesting. And it's interesting that this is framed not just in terms of the human community. I mean, one of the things that struck me, hadn't thought about this at all before, is this relationship between, us, me, and the cosmos. And I love this. What did you call it?
Oikeosis.
Oikeosis. That's hard for this Minnesota boy to say. Oikeosis. The making, the sort of, it's interesting too, because it's, on the one hand, it almost seems like, you're colonizing the cosmos, making it my home. But the way you described it is more like, no, treating it as my household, treating it as I would my household, my stuff, not in an ownership sense, but in a, I am at home in the cosmos because I am related in this way. That's fascinating.
And it's because reason is pervading the cosmos and ordering it all, that then I'm going to get into the action, join in what already is a unified city or polis.
All right. I love that. And I think like both, that is going to take me about a half hour to unpack, because I do not understand the way in which reason could pervade the universe or the cosmos, but also that we might want to have that conversation in the context of Augustine. Because as you were saying, a lot of these ideas get taken up in Augustine, and that's fascinating. And I love Augustine, and you know a ton about Augustine, so I think that would be a cool, productive conversation. But I am going to be fired as a father if I do not show up at this T-ball game.
Yeah.
And so, not fired. I guess you can't fire me. I can't be fired.
No, but you got to play your role well. I agree with the Stoics.
Got to play the role,
there.
man. I'm also a coach, so if I'm not there, like it's going to be a disaster.
As long as they play well, that's you got to take them off of goals. Doesn't matter how many runs they score.
I love it. Well, that is literally how we play this game. We just, everybody bats
learning
once.
From the Stoics.
It's quite stoic. It's T-ball. It's stoic T-ball. Anyway, thank you so much, Caleb. This has been really fascinating, and I really appreciate it. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Great.
All right. We'll see you, Caleb.